My name's Kenneth Pybus. I'm the chair of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at Abilene Christian University. And I'm also a type nerd. I teach a course that's called Communication Design, and much of the course is teaching students how to understand how nonverbal communication impacts how we take in communication messages as much as the verbal communication, the choice of words. And so part of that is the typeface that we choose, part of it is the colors we choose. And so one of the things that we work on is emphasizing the significance of type choice and the history of type. Why we letter forms are shaped the way they are, why we choose typefaces that we choose. And so the assignment that we created in communication design was a recreation of wood type assignment. The goal was, and is, to go back and look at old designs from the 1800s to find samples of those designs, some of which don't exist anymore in physical form, and recreate them in physical form so that they can be reproduced on paper in a movable type situation. I have students design a lot of things on the computer and use typography on the computer, reproduce it, print it out, and they never have a physical, tangible way of interacting with the type. And so one of the goals of this assignment was to have a physical interaction with the typography and to understand the history of type. We know, students know, there's a lot of language that exists around typography. The language of the word font. A font is all of the characters necessary to reproduce a specific typeface in a specific size, shape, and weight. Some of the other language of typography, this is called a sort. It's a single character. If you don't have enough of these to reproduce what you want to design, then you're out of sorts. So in the class, I divided the students into 3 groups and had them recreate the typefaces that exist, some of which don't exist anymore in physical form. And so one example, I had them choose, I gave them a whole book full of, actually several books, full of typefaces that had been designed in the 1800s and many of which don't exist anymore physically. One team chose a Gothic bold, and the challenge is, this is on paper, it is a 3rd generation reproduction of the movable type that existed in the 1800s. And so students scanned this page, imported it into Adobe Illustrator, and then in Adobe Illustrator, created outlines of the character forms. One of the challenges is these characters were designed by hand. Every single A looked slightly different because it was done by hand. And the heights of the characters were a little bit different. The P is a little bit shorter than the A. And so one of the goals was a more consistent size of the stems and the character shapes, a more consistent size of the heights of each character form. So this P is an old P. It's from Hamilton wood type, and this is a recreation of a letter form from more than 100 years ago. This is Gothic Tuscan condensed number 2. And so a typographer in the 1800s would have had drawers full of these pieces of type. Using the CNC router in the Maker Lab at ACU, we can take those letter forms that the students created in Adobe Illustrator, we can export them and import them into the CNC router, and like we did with this piece of type, recreate it. So we recreated it in MDF first, and to make sure it's going to work. And so this is a 3-inch version of the same letter, the same typeface, Gothic Tuscan condensed number 2. So this was one of the fun things that we did. Gothic Tuscan condensed number 2 does not, in any of the samples that we have available to us, does not have numerals, these 1 through 0, and ampersands. And so we really didn't know exactly what those characters looked like historically. But we could look at the other characters and extrapolate what the numerals would look like. And so here's an example. This is 0 or 6 through 0, as you can see. And so the 6, the 7, and then the ampersand. All right. The students and I recreated or redesigned the numerals based on how the characters looked, the other characters looked. And so this is our design from our class based on how we think that the characters would have looked, the numerals would have looked at the time. One of the goals of this project, of course, is to help students learn how to use Illustrator and to learn how to recreate a shape that existed physically and then now exists only on paper. And so of course, students are learning the software as they're redesigning these characters. And so one of the great things about this is forcing students to look at one single character form and then to look at 3 or 4 that maybe are similar. So a P, an R, another character with a stem, and or maybe a C and an O and a Q, and to understand the relationships of contrast and of stress and those things that we talk about in design when we're learning typography. But when they're recreating something, it brings it much more closer to home. And so one of the successes to me is students getting a much deeper appreciation of letter forms and the significance and importance of size and shape and weight and stress and all of these things that we talk about when we're talking about choosing typography and choosing the right type for the right use. And so for students, they're getting a better understanding, and they did get a better understanding of a font's not just a font. A font also communicates things. Gothic Tuscan Condensed No. 2 communicates a whimsy that Gothic Bold Condensed doesn't. And so students appreciate that when they spend some time looking at it in Illustrator day after day and recreating the letter forms. Some of the challenges are learning how to use the CNC router, figuring out the right materials to use. 120 years ago, 150 years ago, they used a hard maple or another kind of wood because that's what they had available to them. We kind of learned that this MDF is almost just as good as when we tested it in print. It will reproduce a character shape, and it will hold the ink just as well as this character from 150 years ago. And so materials, one of the challenges is which material do you use? How do you cut it? Which bit do you use to cut it out? Some of the sharp points are challenging to do, and you have to be very careful to not break the sharp points of the characters off. But you can get a much better and more consistent shape using a CNC router than you ever could with a professional doing it by hand day after day 150 years ago.